In today's discussion, we'll conclude our consideration of the founding, our fourth major discussion of the founding, with a discussion of the remarkably and contemporarily controversial issue of slavery and race. And as you'll see when we come to the Robert Goldwin article at the end, the whole question in some ways of the standards, the evolving, as one might say, evolving moral and social and political standards of the nation versus their embodiment and the nature of those understanding of fundamental rights of individuals at the founding. And obviously race has been very controversial in our country this year. And you'll see probably since the summer, since the death of George Floyd and the protests and the disturbances that ensued, the question came up whether or not the United States is systemically racist, or whether or not there's such a thing as systemic racism. I'm not going to answer that question fully. You have to decide that on your own to some degree. But we will, in fact, look at the question of how racism and other forms of prejudice existed at the time of the founding, especially the controversial and thorny question of slavery. And as we'll see in Goldwin's article, we'll see if there's anything worth in 2021 and beyond in the Constitution and the founding worth celebrating. Now, the way we'll do slavery and race is we'll look at one of the most controversial aspects of scholarship on race that was published 2 years ago in 2019 is a commemoration, as you'll see, of 1619, the very controversial 1619 Project. Sponsored by the New York Times and edited by Nicole Hannah Jones. And what I'll try to do is create a dialogue between that piece and the very controversial claim that it makes that the true founding of the country is in 1619, when the first African American slaves were imported. And then we'll look at two criticisms. One, a fairly intense criticism by Wilfred McClay, a U.S. historian, and this is from an article in Commentary magazine. And then Philip Magnus, who kind of appreciates what the insights of the 1619 Project and sort of stands in the middle between these two positions, you might say, between Hannah Jones and between McClay. And then we'll look at a documentary example of the question of slavery and race in the founding from one of the most authoritative founders, James Madison, from Federalist 54, the only paper that's devoted to the discussion of the controversial 3/5 clause. And we'll see what Madison has to say about that and what that reveals about what Madison as founder, and I think all the founders, to a very large extent, understood on the question of race, what they understood. And we'll close with Robert Goldwin's fine piece from the early 90s, I think, right after the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1987, and his summary about not only the controversial issue of slavery and race, but also gender and religion, by asking, why doesn't the Constitution mention blacks, women, and Jews? So let's begin with the 1619 Project. So as I mentioned, in 2019, the New York Times initiated a project of historical revision. By the way, the term in history, revisionism, refers to a new account of a previously understood historical event, where there might have been a kind of an orthodoxy as to how to interpret that. And revisionism can be either on the right or the left. It's not necessarily attached to either end of the political spectrum. But this was an important revisionism of the understanding of the founding by arguing, as you'll see, that slavery was central to the founding, and that the founding in some ways rests upon slavery and is about slavery. So the purpose of the 1619 Project was to demonstrate that slavery, as I just mentioned, was the foundational institution of America. Nobody, of course, denies that slavery was a critical issue at the founding, but the unique thesis of the 1619 Project and of Hannah Jones is that slavery is foundational to the founding, and that the true origin and date of the nation was 1619, not 1776, the signing and adoption of the Declaration of Independence. I should say the adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. 1619, as I mentioned, was the year that the Jamestown colonists first purchased African American slaves from pirates and therefore signaled the beginnings of plantation slavery in the South. Ironically, and you've already seen this to some degree in some of the material you've already read, and that we'll encounter in a little bit, the 1619's core claim was the same claim, by the way, that Chief Justice Taney made in the 1857 controversial case Dred Scott. Remember, Taney argued, and echoed by Stephen Douglas in the 1858 Illinois Senate debates with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and in the 1860 presidential election, that the framers did not consider African Americans full human beings, and that African Americans were excluded from the founding and from the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So this is from page 4 of Hannah Jones's article. Quote, "The United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, approved on July 4th, 1776, proclaims, quote, that all men are created equal, unquote, and, quote, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, unquote." But she continues, "But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote, did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country." So it's not that Hannah Jones is unaware of the importance of July 4th, 1776, but her thesis is that the framers crafted those principles, and that they did not think that those principles applied to the African American slaves, or even blacks in general, as Taney argues in Dred Scott, in their midst. And as I suggested, this is not a new argument or claim. What was new and radical was Hannah Jones's claim that, and this is the most controversial and in some ways the central contention that she makes, quote, "Conveniently left out of our founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons some of the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In London, there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. This would have upended the economy of the colonies in both the North and the South. In other words, we may never have revolted against Britain if some of the founders had not understood that slavery empowered them to do so. And some might argue that this nation was not founded as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy." And this is from pages 6 to 7 of her article. Now, you remember from Diamond's discussion of the Declaration, he would disagree, by the way, that the Declaration founds a democracy, but rather, as you remember from his article, it's neutral about institutional life. But Hannah Jones is making a more intense and central and controversial claim when she says not a democracy, but a slaveocracy. So you can tell that she understands that, in other words, the people that wrote the words in the Declaration and voted for and adopt them as the justification for the revolution either did not believe them to be true, as, by the way, some Southerners would eventually come to argue, or they were true, but only, as Douglas and Taney say, they understood them only to be applicable to white men or white men of European or British descent. Now, the main evidence for this claim was the offer by the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, as the Revolutionary War progressed, to emancipate slaves of rebellious colonists into his militia. Magnus has a nice discussion of that in the selection I gave you on pages 126 to 7. Further, Hannah Jones claimed that the Constitution continued the exclusion of African Americans from the human race. Quote, "There is no mention of slavery in the final Declaration of Independence. Similarly, 11 years later, when it came time to draft the Constitution, the framers carefully constructed a document that preserved and protected slavery without ever using the word. In the texts in which they were making the case for freedom in the world, they did not want explicitly to enshrine their hypocrisy, so they sought to hide it. Unquote. So when it comes to the Constitution, Hannah Jones argues that the Constitution is essentially a pro-slavery document, as some scholars have argued, by the way, and that its main intention was, as to use her language, to cover up the hypocrisy, and to cover up the hypocrisy by not mentioning slavery, even though it protected it. Now, as you're going to see, the actual place of slavery in the Constitution is very controversial, and we'll see that in some ways Goldwyn will offer a different interpretation of how the Constitution deals with this issue. So let's look at Roman numeral 2 in the notes, and that is the scholarly reaction to and criticism of the 1619 project. It was swift and sharp, as reflected in the work of historians Wilfred Maclay, and this is again from commentary on February 13th, 2020, an article entitled How the New York Times is Distorting American History, and Philip Magnus, and this is from his larger book, The 1619 Project, a Critique. Again, as I mentioned above, Magnus is critical of the 1619 Project, especially on this central claim that a primary motive, if not the central motive, which I think Hannah Jones does come close to claiming, that the central motive of the revolution was to preserve the institution of slavery. Again, Magnus, in his larger book, affirms that the 1619 Project did contain insights and does reveal some important aspects of history. But and therefore he affirms its value to some degree, but he feels, as you'll see, the need to correct its inaccuracies and distortions as he sees them. And therefore, as I said, you can kind of see him in the middle between Hannah Jones and Maclay. So Maclay says, be that as it may, we can say this much. Considered strictly as an exercise in historical understanding and in deepening the public's understanding of a profound issue in our national past, the project represents a giant missed opportunity. This is Wilfred Maclay speaking. It passes over the complex truth in favor of an exaggeration bordering on travesty. That's from page 1 of his article. In the epitaph to his book, Magnus recounts how, when faced by criticism of scholars, Hannah Jones and the editors of the New York Times backed down from their original claims with the correction that only some of the colonists were moved by the desire to preserve slavery. Thus, we are left with, quote, could be read to suggest, according to both Maclay and Magnus to some degree, that tepid backtracking, in effect, gave away the game. It's a fitting epitaph to what could have been an important and provocative contribution to historical inquiry about the lasting harms of slavery in the United States, but instead veered down the path of an ideological project consumed by maintaining its own 21st century political narrative about the history it weaponized to that cause. That's also from Magnus. So, in Roman numeral 3 then, let's look at what Maclay and to some degree Magnus call the complex truth. What is the complex truth about the place of slavery in the founding and the place of race and other issues of inclusiveness in the constitutional system since the founding? Wilfred Maclay suggests that the main failure of the 1619 Project was to educate students about the complex truth of the American founding and the nature of slavery in the world then and today. This is now quoting from his article, quote, here we come to an example of a real failure in our educational system, something that the Times could actually have helped to address. Most of my college students come to class without any larger context for their understanding of American slavery. They compare the realities of American life against an abstract standard of perfection and find them wanting. That is to say, the realities of American life. He continues, moreover, they believe that slavery is uniquely American and uniquely Southern, and that freedom and prosperity are the default position of the human race. They are shocked and disbelieving when they are told that slavery has existed over all the world, in most cultures, and most time periods in human history, and that it has been, in fact, been more the rule than the exception in human history. They do not know that the Greeks, the Romans, the Vikings, the Byzantines, the Ethiopians all embraced slavery. He continues, they are shocked to learn that American slavery was exponentially more humane, say, than that of Brazil, and that the American portion of the slaves imported from Africa was only about 4 to 5% of the total number imported to the Western Hemisphere. They are shocked to learn about the role of Islam in the propagation of slavery. They are shocked to know that slavery still exists openly today in countries such as Mauritania, and our vaunted agencies of international governance do little to nothing about it, unquote. That's from page 3. So I have to say, as a political science professor who's been teaching college students for now 40 years, that his general comment, and I'm not insulting my students, it just happens to be the case. Here's just a sad fact. Most American high school students are pitiably deficient in both world and American historical knowledge, and only 19% of all the several 3,500 colleges and universities in America even have a history requirement. Only 19%. I have to say, and I'm not insulting my students, I am pointing out that when it comes to the historical knowledge to weigh these controversial claims, not only about America, but about the rest of the world, they do lack a historical foundation. And it also means that distressing statistic that only 19% of colleges and universities have a history requirement, that generally speaking, Americans will exit college as historically ignorant as they were when they entered it. And I do find that distressing. I share that not only with McClay, but with most of my colleagues in the academic world. As a testimony, continuing now with the issue, to the complexity of slavery and race in the founding, we conclude with a passage from Federalist 54, in which James Madison explains the 3/5 clause. And we'll come back to that because you're going to see Goldwyn has a wider commentary on that, and I think a clear and helpful commentary. That clause occurs in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. The clause was a compromise between the North, and you'll see Goldwyn explained this very nicely, the North, who did not want to count slaves at all for purposes of representation, therefore denying to the South any benefit from treating people as property, and the South, who ironically, this is the most surprising thing that American students learn, or that people learn. It's the South, the slave-owning part of the country, that wanted to count slaves as whole people for purposes of representation. So that would give them an advantage in the House of Representatives. Madison, one of the architects of the Constitution, and quite aware, as a slave owner, by the way, Madison, like Jefferson, like Washington, like Monroe, were slave owners. He was aware of the discrepancy between the Declaration's promise and the reality of slavery. In this paper defending the 3/5 clause, this is what I want you to grasp. And what's interesting about this paper, he creates a fictional character to defend this clause, almost as if he did not want to speak in his own name. He creates this character called a Southern brother. And note, in all the 85 Federalist Papers, this is the only one where either on the part of Hamilton, Madison, or Jay, the three authors who, under the pseudonym of Publius, as we saw in the last lecture, wrote the Federalist Papers. This is the only major argument in the entire Federalist Papers that's presented through the mouth of a fictional character. Now the question is, what does that mean? And, as you'll see, that interpretive question also has to be guided by what Madison puts in the mouth of that character. Let me prep you for this. Of all the characters to come forward and defend the 3/5 clause, a Southern brother, this individual would be the one most likely to see the simple goodness or naturalness of slavery. So pay attention and to the words that Madison puts in the mouth of this Southern brother. Quote, "We subscribe to the doctrine," unquote. And this is Madison speaking. Might one of our Southern brethren observe, quote, "that representation relates more immediately to the persons, and taxation more immediately to property, and we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property, and in no respect whatever as persons. The true state of the case is, that is to say, the real state under Southern laws, that's what the Southern brother means, is that they partake of both of these qualities, being considered by our laws." Note, the Southern brother himself admits that it's the laws of the Southern states that create this ambiguous and torn nature of African Americans both as property and as persons. By our laws, in some respects as persons, and in other respects as property. In being compelled to labor not for himself, but for a master. In being vendible, saleable, that is, capable of being sold as an item of property. Vendible, that's what the word vendible means. By one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body. And note the adjective that Madison puts in the mouth of his Southern brother. By the capricious will of another. Caprice or capriciousness means the lack of a satisfactory rationale for what you're doing. To behave capriciously means to behave without clear reason or rationality, to behave willfully. The capricious will of another. The slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank, and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. In being protected, on the other hand, and American students, I think, are amazed to discover the facticity of the next several statements, but listen to what he says. So what he's just finished is saying, in what sense the laws of the South treat African Americans as property. In being protected, on the other hand, in his life and his limbs, against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, in being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society and not as part of the irrational creation, as a moral person and not a mere article of property. He's right about that. All the Southern states, by the way, if a slave committed a murder or assault or some other violent crime, they were tried in court as moral persons. If an ox, to use an example from Jewish law, if an ox or farm animal gores somebody or injures somebody, the ox is killed not because the ox is morally responsible or guilty as a person for his act, but because he's a dangerous creature. So this is true. Many Southern states, it varied from state to state to what extent a slave was protected in his or her person against the violence of his master. But there's no question that Southern law held African Americans responsible for the crimes, which means they were considered by their laws, even the laws of the Southern states, as moral persons. The federal Constitution, Madison continues, his Southern brother to continue on to say, the federal Constitution therefore decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character of persons and property. This is in fact their true, and by true he doesn't mean, as you'll see, look very carefully, I'm going to point out the language in the rest of this paragraph. When he says their true character, he means their existent character under Southern law. This is in fact their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live. And it will not be denied, now listen very carefully to this, that those are the proper criteria, because it is only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property, that a place is disputed to them in the computation of numbers for representation. And it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negro could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants. So there you have Madison putting in the mouth of the character most favorable towards the institution of slavery, his Southern brother, the admission that it's the laws of the Southern states that have actually taken away the natural rights, that that there is in fact a kind of a sublayer of injustice to these laws. Now you could say, well, fine, he's just a hypocrite. After all, he was a slave owner, and he didn't want to come forward himself in his own name and confess his guilt and his hypocrisy. I think Madison, as you're going to argue, and this is where Goldwyn will take up, and where to be honest, I agree with Goldwyn's position, that the bulk of the framers were quite aware that slavery as an institution was inconsistent with the principles of the Declaration, and therefore the question was how to found the country in the Constitution. And it is that question to which Goldwyn turns. So the title of Goldwyn's article is Why Blacks, Women, and Jews Are Not Mentioned in the Constitution. Now again, the historical background for this, Goldwyn was a political scientist who, for many years, he was a researcher and writer with the American Enterprise Institute, and in fact was an editor of a volume that I wrote, contributed an essay on, how the Constitution secures religious liberty. I wrote an essay on the American civil religion and published it in 1988. So in 1987, as you already know, the Constitutional Convention was in 1787, hence, and the Constitution was finished on September 17th, 1787, the last day of the Constitutional Convention. Hence, 1987 was the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And so, in the midst of the controversies of the 60s, the Civil Rights struggle, the Equal Rights Amendment, the whole controversy over the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, which, by the way, has become contemporarily of interest. Goldwyn's aim is to see, since the tendency of our time is to see the founding as so flawed, so reflective of retrograde values, and indeed, as we'll see, which does in fact protect slavery, that the Constitution is not worth celebrating. As you're going to see, Goldwyn denies that. Here is his thesis, and you'll see this also points to the method. This is on page 10. The inescapable fact is that many subjects not mentioned in the Constitution must be interpreted unavoidably by anyone for whom the meaning of the Constitution is important. My argument is that there are valuable lessons to be learned about how we are constituted as a nation, and what in the original Constitution is worth celebrating, by devoting serious attention to subjects not mentioned in it. For that purpose, I propose close attention to three subjects: blacks, women, and Jews. Now, in a way, as you're going to see, his framing point, his larger point, is that the Constitution, our Constitution, any Constitution, while it does do certain critical things in a founding, it founds the country in the sense that it provides the core structures of the institution. It channels the power that governs society. Go back to my first discussion of this, of the regime, or what a constitutional regime is: ideas, institutions, laws and policies, and way of life. Obviously, there was a certain way of life of Americans as colonists, as British colonists, and everything that they brought to American culture prior to the founding, and that there is a certain sense in which there was a society in place. Yet, as you'll see, Goldwyn's argument, which I accept, is that the Declaration and the Constitution provide the foundation for our society in decisive ways. The Declaration, because it sets our core principles up, as we've already described and discussed in this class, but the Constitution because it is the institutional form of our life. Now, Goldman's main point here is therefore the Constitution can and does settle many important things, but it can't possibly settle every issue in society. And we'll see there were particular issues with the question of slavery, why it couldn't solve that, at least according to our lights today. And next week we are going to consider the actual text of the Constitution with an intensive review in the language and the provisions of the Constitution, and you'll see the Constitution does deal with a lot of things to point to Goldwyn, but it also again leaves out. Unlike, for instance, two other constitutions I like to use an example that I have direct experience of, and that is the Indian Constitution, which I was in India for 7 weeks in 1990, which is 237 pages long. Because, again, the Indian Constitution tries to settle all kinds of economic, social issues. There are complex issues in Indian society about caste, the Brahmins, etc., and the untouchables, and it was an expressly socialist constitution. Or the Constitution of the European Union, which is, I think, extends to some 510 pages. Those constitutions are so long because they try to solve all the questions. The American Constitution does not. And as he points out, there are all kinds of issues that we see today within the rubric of the Constitution through interpretation that it doesn't deal with. The Constitution is only about 7 pages long and only has about 28 amendments, one of the most rarely amended written constitutions still surviving today. So remember, his point is the Constitution did not and could not deal with all these critical issues that with which we concern ourselves today, and I think which most of us would consider that we stand in a more advanced position or progressed position than at the founding. And as you'll see, we're going to discuss an important court case in a couple of weeks when we discuss federalism, McCulloch v. Maryland. And as you're going to see, both there and later on in the course when we deal with the critical court case in 1803, also, by the way, both of these opinions written by Chief Justice John Marshall, the first truly great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In McCulloch, in both Marbury v. Madison, which some of you may already have read in high school or perhaps in college, a constitution is to set out broad lines of the structure of government and to kind of set the society in motion. Now, you should be aware, by the way, that Goldwyn does not deny the existence of racial prejudice at the time of the founding, or, for that matter, in the rest of American society. This is from page 14 towards the bottom of the page. We must acknowledge that there was indeed intense and widespread racism among Americans, which helped to sustain for so long the vicious system of black slavery, and its century-long aftermath of racial segregation, discrimination, persecution, and even hatred. How best can we understand the meaning of this disjunction between the racism in the society and the absence of it in the written Constitution? So that leads, as you'll see, to perhaps the most fundamental framework of analysis or reference in Goldwyn's article. This is on the bottom of page 14 and the top of 15. It's so cogent and important to his whole argument, and as you'll see, true, I think, that it's worth reading the entire paragraph. So, and you'll see this points to the specific dilemma of addressing the issue of slavery at the time of the founding. On the bottom of page 14 and the top of page 15. If a written constitution is not in close accord with the way that society itself is constituted, it will be irrelevant to the everyday life of the people. A constitution will be a failure if it is no more than a beautiful portrait of an ugly society. But it must be more than an accurate description of how the society is constituted. A good constitution provides guidance and structure for the improvement of the society. A good constitution is designed to make the political science better than it is, and the citizens better persons. It must be enough like the institutions and the people to be relevant to the working of the society, but it should also have what might be called a formative features, a capacity to make us better if we live according to its provisions and adhere to its institutional arrangements. The constitutional goal for Americans would be to develop a nation of self-governing, liberty-loving citizens in a new kind of political society where the fundamental rights of all would be secure. And that would mean a society where slavery would have no place. Now, obviously, that means, and I think, by the way, some evidence for his argument that the framers were aware of the distance between both the actual way of life of Americans, at least a substantial portion of the American people, and not only the fact that southern states allowed the slavery, but in the broad kind of racial prejudice that most Americans had at that time and have had through a large portion of our history. This is so. Understand then that his argument is that a constitution, and this is the dilemma in forming a constitution, it has to be close enough to the way people actually live and think and work, or else they'll just ignore it, or it won't have no effect on the country. Yet it's got to be more than simply a description of an arrangement that the people at that time feel comfortable with. It has aspirational features. That's the way I would put it as to what he means by that. So with that in mind, let's examine the three specific issues of race, gender, and religion that he writes. First, slavery and race. Now, he covers the same kind of territory that both Hannah Jones and the other authors, Magnus and Maclay, to some degree cover in their essays, and also the same issue that Madison was defending in Federalist 54. But Goldwyn's description of this issue is so cogent and so well constructed and written, and I think it's worth looking at it more specifically. Now, he begins with what is probably the most common misconception of what the 3/5 clause is. And I've already pointed to that to some degree in our discussion of the quote from Federalist 54. What's the implication of the 3/5 clause in Article 1, Section 2 that many Americans, both historians, interestingly enough, he quotes a couple of critical historians, John Hope Franklin, etc., but then probably most Americans, in fact, my guess is probably most of you thought the purpose of. And that misconception, according to Goldwyn, is that the founders considered African Americans to be 3/5 of a human being. So, in responding to that, Goldwyn sums up what was the real purpose of the 3/5 clause. The critical thing you have to understand its presence in the Constitution. But to understand what the original Constitution had to say about blacks, the point is that the 3/5 clause, by the way, this is in the middle of page 13, the point is that the 3/5 clause had nothing at all to do with measuring the human worth of blacks. Northern delegates, as I pointed out in our discussion of Federalist 54, Northern delegates did not want black slaves included, not because they thought them unworthy of being counted, but because they wanted to weaken the slave-holding power of Congress in the constitutional system. Southern delegates wanted every slave to count equally with the whites, not because they wanted to proclaim that black slaves were human beings, even though, as Madison points out, the laws of southern states for certain purposes treated African Americans as moral persons, were on an equal footing with free white persons, but because they wanted to increase the pro-slavery voting power in Congress. The humanity of blacks was not the subject of the 3/5 clause. Voting power in Congress was the subject. And when we come to our intensive reading of the Constitution in a little bit, and we'll look at this, I'm going to point you to the three places in the Constitution, also mentioned by Goldwyn, by the way, where slavery is dealt with. And his core point is those clauses represent a compromise between the southern and the northern states, and the critical centrality of that compromise I'll come back to just a minute, which you can't forget. But his point is the issue was the part of on the north, they wanted to decrease the power of southern voting power in the whole constitutional system, with the hopes, and of course the part of the southern, the point of the southern point of view was to increase the power of the slaveholding societies within the constitutional system. He points out, by the way, as historians have, that the Senate, for instance, in which each state is represented equally by 2 senators, that became the focus of contention and controversy in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s in terms of the admission of new states, because for every free state that was admitted, the Southerns wanted a southern state, and that would retain a balance, an equal balance of slave and southern states. But the House of Representatives presented a unique problem, because, as we've seen already from our discussion of the founding, and we'll see when we talk about the text of the Constitution, the House was based on proportional representation of the American people, and that meant you had to consider Americans as individuals. Therefore, the question of representation in the House unavoidably brought up the question of slavery, in which, by the way, you had whole tracts of the population that were not treated with respect to representation. Now, again, you have to remember here that the South is the one that wanted to count slaves as whole persons, and it's the North that didn't want to count slaves as persons at all. Ironically, this went contrary to their core positions on the question of the humanity of African Americans and slaves, and that of slaves. So you have to remember why then the Constitution was erected on this compromise, because the Constitution would not have existed without this compromise. This was, and they all knew it, as Madison points out, this was the great issue. And in our discussion of the Constitutional Convention, I tried to point out there were times when the issue of slavery, especially in August, when the convention resumed after its recess, where the issue of slavery almost derailed the whole convention and brought the process to an end. And you have to remember, from the standpoint of what you could or can't do, in politics, as I like to point out in my political theory classes, you could say the range of action runs from achieving the good. Let's say your aim is to make society better. Maybe you can do that. But as you're going to see, and Madison pointed out, as we've seen in Federalist 10 and 51, human beings are flawed. They are guided by their self-interest, and that to some degree, passion and opinion and self-interest can make people not see a self-evident truth in front of them. So in some ways, you have to remember that that the unique position of slavery was granted by the centrality and the depth of disagreement on this issue. The question was whether there was going to be a country or not. You could say, had we stayed with the Articles, and this is probably true, slavery would have lasted much longer. Lincoln thought, as did Frederick Douglass, and most of the Republicans in the North at the time of the war in the 1860s, that the Constitution did compromise with slavery so as to launch the nation, but then set up, and this is Goldwyn's thesis, by the way, a structure and process by which slavery could eventually be eliminated. So that was the reason for the 3/5 clause, the proper understanding of it. And again, to make sure you grasp Goldwyn's main point, you can't generalize from the 3/5 clause or the other provisions that protect slavery in Article 1, Section 9, the importation clause, the migration and importation clause, and in Article 4, Section 2, the fugitive slave clause. You can't generalize from the text of the Constitution, which is, by the way, as both Lincoln pointed out and as Goldwyn points out, every place where slaves are mentioned, they are described as persons, which by the laws of their states are treated as something else. So that is his interpretation of the 3/5 clause. And to go back, by the way, on page 14, he has another nice comment about the Constitution's relative place in both the unfolding of racial controversial and the civil rights movements since the time of the founding, and how the Constitution was in fact not silent on the question of slavery. In fact, was a kind of a guide to the resolution of racial issues. This is in the second paragraph from the bottom of the page on page 14. Therefore, when the time came to terminate official segregation, which was held by the laws of several of the states, we had to purge the racial provisions from federal regulations like those segregating the armed forces. Harry Truman was the first president to desegregate the armed forces. And from state constitutions and state and local laws, which most of you know, for instance, that's what Brown v. Board of Education was about. But not, so that those things had to be purged from state laws, federal policies, and certain practices. But race didn't have to be purged from the Constitution because the Constitution never embraced a theory of the value of or humanity of different races. But not from the Constitution of the United States. In fact, lawyers and judges were able to argue for profound changes by asserting that they were in accord with and demanded by the Constitution. This is Goldwyn's summary of this issue. We did not have to change it to fit new circumstances and times. Instead, the argument could be made, and was made, that conditions had to be changed to fit the Constitution. In that historic national effort, it made a very great difference that there was no racism in the original Constitution. And that's Goldwyn's take on the issue of race. Now, you're going to see that textually, when it comes to gender, and to some degree the issue of religion and religious affiliation, Goldwyn makes the same argument from the Constitution's embrace of the language of personhood. We'll see about his specific issue of why people think that women were not mentioned in the Constitution or dealt with, and why you needed the 19th Amendment. Now, you probably still needed the 19th Amendment, but as you're going to see, it's not because the Constitution embraced or enshrined patriarchy. Goldwyn is going to argue that the Constitution is gender neutral. Now, we'll see how he makes that argument. But I have to begin with a factual error that Goldwyn makes. He says on page 16, it is remarkable that they are not excluded from any one of these groups because in 1787, women did not vote or hold office anywhere in the United States and were excluded from every level of government. That's actually factually an error. I never spoke with Goldwyn about this, but I provided the website that corrects that. It turns out that women in New Jersey, by the way, unmarried women could vote and hold office. So look at that website that I gave you. So that's a factual error. But what's his core argument here? His core argument is that when it comes to office holding and the qualifications for electors and everything, it uses the word persons. Now, what would be the evidence that the framers excluded women from the promise of personhood? The existence of the male pronoun. That it says the president should take his oath of office, etc. Now, Goldwyn's dismissal of that argument, or his arguing that it's not persuasive, is essentially a reference to the fact that prior to the linguistic reform movements of the 70s and 80s, and to some degree one that we're still in with the whole question of different gender pronouns, the male pronoun was understood to be inclusive, just like the question of gender in the Bible where God is referred to as his or he, when in reality the use of that pronoun was supposed to be gender neutral. Although Goldwyn does offer a stronger textual argument that person, just because the male pronoun is used in the Constitution, this is critical when you're interpreting the text of a document, you have to show evidence within the text, and this is his proof, that everywhere else where the Constitution refers to person and uses the male pronoun, such as in the Fifth Amendment, etc., or the clause in Article 4 for the returning the extradition of criminals, where it uses the word his, it clearly refers to both men and women. So his specific argument is there is no maleness or patriarchy embodied in the Constitution's embrace of the male pronoun, not only because that was the custom of the time up until very recently, but also the text of the Constitution refers to other places where women are clearly understood to be included in that pronoun, and that therefore, even though the 19th Amendment made sure that states, etc., did not deny the franchise because of gender, the original Constitution itself was as open to women participation as to men. And the last one, religious freedom. And I should say, by the way, what Golden is arguing here with respect to Jews, because Jews were a remarkably persecuted race for 1,500 years, and that to a very real extent. And if you want a nice confirmation of that, you should read Washington's letter to the Truro Synagogue in Providence, Rhode Island. It's one of the great classics of American political writing, where Washington extends to the Jewish members of the Truro Synagogue congregation that they are full citizens, not guests, but full citizens. And Golden's point is the Constitution doesn't mention Jews because it doesn't mention Baptists or Methodists or anyone else, or Muslims or Hindus. And by the way, you have to remember, he is clear that we're talking about the unamended Constitution. This is the Constitution without the First Amendment, the Free Exercise Clause, and the Establishment Clause. So where in the Constitution is religious, not only, as you're going to see, religious freedom and practice enshrined, but also religious friendship? That the framers anticipated a kind of a society in which traditionally historical religious enemies, Protestants and Catholics, Hindus and Muslims, would enter into a civil society where they were now free and equal and respectful of each other. And I'll just briefly say that's in Article 6. And that is the no religious test. And he has a very fine discussion of what it means to say no religious tests. That means exactly what it says. Religion is the one qualification which the original Constitution says cannot be made a test for office under the United States and the Constitution. Now, there's another issue which we'll see, by the way, when we turn to the text of the Constitution, and that is both in the presidential oath and in the oath which all public officers on every level of government have to take in Article 6 to support the Constitution. It says oath or affirmation or swear or affirm. An oath or swearing is a religious public vow. An affirmation is a secular one, and we'll come back to that when we discuss the text of the Constitution. So he is correct. The original Constitution meant to erect a public order in which religious differences were no longer a measure of an individual's or a community's ability to participate and be a part of the American enterprise. So, to sum up this controversial section regarding the founding, I do, in fact, I'm persuaded by Goldwyn's approach that the founding was aspirational. It looked forward to, its aim was to found a society with the capacity for improvement and greater inclusion. So that means the founding is both aspirational and incomplete, and in Goldwyn's understanding, therefore worth celebrating. Why? Madison and the other founders understood that slavery consisted of depriving, as we've seen in the text of Federalist 54, African Americans of their natural rights as human beings, and looked forward to the day when future Americans, generations of Americans, could and would perfect the nation launched by the Revolution and the Constitution by removing the stain of slavery that they could not. Could the founders imagine a future American society where blacks and whites and all races could live in political equality and social harmony with each other? Could they imagine a future American society where women and men were full and equal partners, participants in political life? Could they imagine a future American society where Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Hindus, and people of all faiths, would view each other equally as Americans and welcome the diversity of faiths as part of the new friendship between religions that American citizenship would make possible and indeed facilitated? They could and did. And they left it up to us to complete the founding by turning the declarations and the Constitution's potentials into reality. That work still remains for us today. The possibility of completing that work in an institutional structure that by and large has guaranteed more freedom, stability, and prosperity, eventually to include all the different ethnicities and religions and parts of humanity, the first truly universal nature. The Constitution is worth celebrating because it is the seed of that vision and the foundation of it.